And our attendees are coming in. All right. All right. Hi, everybody. It looks like I see all the attendees jumping in now. Welcome. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes before I do introductions. But we are here tonight with Dr. Bertha Madras, and she's going to be talking with us about THC. And oh, this is great. We have a bunch of people coming on. So let me at least start by introducing the coalition. So my name is Ananda Lennox. I am the coordinator of the West Springfield CARE Coalition, and our mission is to reduce, delay, and ultimately eliminate youth substance use for the youth of West Springfield. And I'm just checking my chats on the side, make sure nobody's having trouble getting in. Tonight, we're fortunate to have an exceptional speaker whom I've had the pleasure of seeing present twice before. The first time I heard Dr. Madras speak, I had 2 high school students with me who were interested in advocacy and public service. And what struck me during both opportunities is how powerful science can be. Dr. Madras delivered her research findings in such a way that both my students and I walked away from her talk with a new and better understanding of how THC operates and how our brains operate. She certainly used science to peel back so many preconceived notions that we held about THC. So tonight you will all have the same opportunity, and it is my hope that you will also walk away from this experience with a greater understanding not only about cannabis, but the important differences between youth use and adult use. Before I introduce Dr. Madras, some minor housekeeping. Generally, I orient people to where the restrooms are, but since you're all comfortable at home, that should be unnecessary. You're all going to be muted throughout the event, and your videos are not on, but we are going to have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you do have a question for Dr. Madras, please enter it into the chat once the chat function is enabled, and I will read the questions aloud so that she can answer them. And at the end of the event, we're going to have a short survey that's going to go out to you. Please fill this out for us. It helps us to know what our community needs and also helps us to secure funding for this event and future ones. And lastly, Dr. Madras has granted us permission to record this event so that community members who are unable to attend could view it at a later date. The video will be eventually made available on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to read a brief bio sketch on Dr. Madras. Bertha K. Madras, PhD, is a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School, based at McLean Hospital and cross-appointed at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Her research focuses on neurobiology, imaging, and medication development for neuropsychiatric disorders. She currently holds, at least at this printing, 19 US and 27 international patents. In public policy, she was Deputy Director for Demand Reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, a presidential appointment confirmed unanimously by the US Senate. Dr. Madras recently served as a panelist at the Vatican Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and in 2017 was appointed as one of 6 members of the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis. In service to the public, she developed a museum exhibit and a CD, licensed by Disney, with the Museum of Science Boston. She is the recipient of an NIH Merit Award, a NIDA Public Service Award, and others. Recently, Dr. Madras's research has focused on the effects of drugs on the developing adolescent brain and on the adult brain, to illuminate why early drug initiators are more susceptible to addiction, cognitive impairment, and other adverse effects. Currently, her laboratory is comparing the behavioral and molecular consequences of cannabinoid exposure in adolescent and adult primates to discern whether the psychoactive cannabinoid THC produces different effects in the 2 age cohorts, and whether cannabidiol modulates these effects. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Madras, and hold your questions till the end. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I know this is the dinner hour, so the fact that you're here is very comforting to me, because it's pretty hard to worry about children and to take care of all sorts of responsibilities after a day's work, and still be able to log on to what hopefully will be interesting and relevant to you. But it still is going to be almost taking a drink out of a fire hydrant, because there's so much information that I would like to share with you. Can everyone see my slides now? There's no response. Amanda, could you tell me if my slides are visible?
I always forget to unmute myself. I'm not seeing anything in the chat that people cannot see it, and I can see it, so I think
You
we're
can
good.
see it. Wonderful. Okay, then. So what I'm going to discuss today is marijuana on your brain, on children's brains, on the brains of developing fetuses. And to begin by focusing on alarming trends that I think are happening in our country. One of the most alarming of all is the fact that marijuana use and marijuana use disorders, which used to be called addiction, but now are longest spectrum of risky, uncontrollable use, they're rising. Marijuana potency is rising, and we're going to try to find out what that means in terms of consequences. Marijuana consequences are rising for the fetus, not necessarily that there are more of them, but the fact that there are more users means that there are more children who could be affected by them. The consequences to adolescents are rising because there are more adolescents using, and also there's more problems associated with use. And finally, I'm going to try to discuss what lessons we've learned from this episode in our history, and also give you a very brief overview of what you can do about it. So marijuana use is rising rapidly. It's rising especially among 18 to 25-year-olds, but also increasingly amongst adolescents and amongst people who are older than 55. The rise is primarily in adults of childbearing and child-rearing ages. And the number of people who have a cannabis use disorder between the ages of 12 and 17, it's only 4%, but amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds, it's over 13%. And that is really a problem because, as I said, these are people who are in a childbearing and child-rearing ages, and we'll understand what that means shortly. Between 2016 and 2019, unfortunately, some of the most recent data has not been issued by SAMHSA, so we have to rely on a little bit of outdated data, but there are almost 1 million more people that have a marijuana use disorder or cannabis use disorder. Between ages of 12 and 17, over 100,000, 18 to 25, 300,000, and the 26 years and older is 500,000 or more. And this number is likely to be much higher when the new data are issued past with the 2021 data, which should have been issued in September and still hasn't come out. Why am I worried about the 18 to 25-year-olds, people of childbearing and child-rearing ages? Because one of the studies that we reported in 2019 is that offspring of mothers or fathers who use marijuana, whether they're 12 to 17-year-old or they're 18 to 30-year-old, they have a much higher likelihood of using marijuana. Even if they're 18 to 30-year-old, if they're living in the same household as parents, they are much more likely to use. What does that mean? That means the parental influence can be both positive and negative with regard to drug use. And there's so much more to say on this topic, but I'm trying to cover a heck of a lot in a very short time. Parents that have a marijuana use disorder, if you can compare what happens to the children, there is a much higher likelihood of a child having a violent offense. This is a huge study that was published in JAMA Psychiatry recently from a European cohort that had excellent data. And children of parents who have a cannabis use disorder are much more likely to attempt suicide. And interestingly enough, marijuana ranks first. It ranks ahead of alcohol. It ranks ahead of parents who've tried suicide or parents with antisocial behaviors. So it seems that marijuana has this #1 probability of making life a little more difficult for the children. And that's not good as well. Now, what about the trends in marijuana use? Let's just summarize what I've said. The past year use of marijuana has risen. Nearly 1 million more people are that use marijuana have a cannabis use disorder now. And children of marijuana using parents are more likely to use, and children of parents with a cannabis use disorder are more likely to commit violent offenses. We're going to move on now to another issue that is rising, and that is marijuana potency. The composition of marijuana is based on how much there is, the total amount, the dose, and also the amount of cannabinoids in marijuana plant. The key constituent, the key content of marijuana is THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. The amount of THC that's present and the percent THC in terms of a dry weight of a plant or a dry weight of any other form of marijuana is critical. The frequency at which it's used is also critical. Is it used more than once daily, or just daily, or weekly, or monthly, or yearly? All of these factors have an influence on what happens to the user, because infrequent use has very low probability of having consequences, like once yearly, but certainly unless you're driving or doing something that involves cognitive ability or coordination. And the other consequence that's important is the onset of age at which people use, because prenatal exposure, early adolescent exposure is associated with some very serious consequences. Another important issue on marijuana is, how is it delivered? Is it inhaled? Is it vaped? Is it ingested? Because all of these effects will influence what the effects of marijuana are. What we have seen since the 1970s is that the potency of THC has risen dramatically. In some cases, in most plants now, it's about 20%. In some of the concentrates, the dabs, the shatters, it can be up to 90%. And of course, why are manufacturers, why are profiteers doing this? Because the higher the potency, the greater high. You develop more tolerance to the drug, which means you have to take more and more to get the same effect. The addictive potential is higher and the use is higher if the effects are more robust. So what are we seeing in terms of high potency? We're seeing that the percent of THC in marijuana, which is advertised for medical or recreational purposes, is pretty much the same. It's hovering around 20% in the plant. It used to be about 3%. 70% of the products advertised have more than 15% THC, which is 5 times more than it used to be about 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that's regardless of medicinal or recreational programs. And of course, these higher potencies are completely unsuitable if people use them for medicinal purposes, because there's no data on these high potency forms for any sort of medicine or any medical applications. So it's really a problem. High potency use is more common in states with legal marijuana or medical marijuana, so that we have a much higher amount of all-purpose. People use for all reasons, for medical and for illegal. It's more common in the states. What do users report? They report that they like stronger intoxication, They feel the effects longer. It takes fewer hits to get the same response. Now, whoops, I'm sorry, there we go. So what are some of the consequences of this high potency? We'll take a look quickly at adolescents. What are the comparisons between using high versus low potency? The likelihood of regular marijuana use is much greater if you use high potency. The likelihood of having use problems is greater if you use high potency. The likelihood of using other drugs, other illicit drugs, is much greater if you use high potency marijuana. The likelihood of being dependent on tobacco is higher. The likelihood of having alcohol use disorder is also higher. So these are some of the summary things, and this is adolescent marijuana users. In college students, we see the same issue. Problems associated with the use of butane hash oil or dabs, which is about 50 to 60% THC, unheard of a few years ago, completely unnatural. This is no longer a natural plant. This is a plant that's been processed to make it into a very significant mind-altering drug. So college students, if they use butane hash oil, they're more likely to use more frequently, to use other drugs, to become physically dependent, to binge drink. They have impaired control. They have academic problems. There's so many others that I won't get into, but there is really a problem with using these high potency formulations. The percent THC is also associated with first-time treatment for cannabis use disorder. As THC increased, so did the prevalence of addiction to marijuana. Edibles and vaporized marijuana are associated with psychiatric symptoms in adolescents. If the number is 1, there's no increased risk. If it's above 1, the risk is higher for conduct problems, for depressive symptoms, for anhedonia, which means losing joy in life, and for sensation seeking. I've also left out suicidality, which is also increasing. And one can see brain changes with high percentage THC. This is the corpus callosum, which is a critical piece that links two sides of the brain. And it's rich in cannabinoid receptors during neurodevelopment. It's critical for connecting the left and right parts of the brain. And frequent high potency marijuana is associated with disturbed microstructures in users, whether they have psychosis or not. So let's just summarize the increasing concerns about rising marijuana potency. It's associated with greater harms, with more cannabis use disorder or marijuana use disorder. In the olden days, we called it addiction or severe use disorder. It's associated with more severe use disorder. It's associated with more anxiety disorders. Higher potency is associated with psychotic disorders, with more memory impairment, excuse me, and more social problems. All of these things have been introduced with higher THC concentrations, which apparently bring greater profits and a higher number of users. What are the consequences of marijuana to the fetus? I say the consequences are rising, not necessarily because there's more and more things happening to the fetus. It's because there are more women who are pregnant who are using, and also there's more information on what the consequences are with regard to a fetus that's exposed to THC. Brain development is one of the most fascinating parts of brain biology, because you start from a single cell and you develop 80 billion cells. Each one of them has a signature of uniqueness in terms of function. And there are, of course, close to 1 trillion supporting cells that do a lot of things, including damage the brain. And what's fascinating that people were not aware of until just a few years ago is that the cannabinoid system inside the brain, embedded in the brain, is critical for brain development. So we have a cannabinoid system in our brain. We have cannabinoid signaling. The signaling is not at all identical to what THC or cannabinoids in plants are, because the chemistry is different. But these compounds like THC can invade that signaling system and produce changes in it, which can interfere with brain development. So during the first few days and weeks, the cannabinoid system helps to make new brain cells. It guides what type of brain cell to make. There are many different types of brain cells that do many different functions. It guides them to their targets so they can link up all their connections. For example, when you type in a telephone into your iPhone, you're linking up a connection between you and somebody else, a close friend. Think about this. Each nerve cell can have 1 or up to 20,000 different connections. Think of your cell phone having 20,000 different phone connections, phone numbers in it. And what if those connections are all messed up? What if you dial in the wrong numbers, or you dial Asia instead of Africa, or you dial your mother when you're trying to dial a friend, or some other mismatch between where you're supposed to call and where you're actually calling. So these endocannabinoids are critical to guide nerve cells to make connections with others, to help make connections. They promote the birth of new brain cells. They tell the cells what type they should become. They guide them to their targets. They help them form connections. And during adolescence, they help them prune and get rid of unused, unnecessary junk connections. For example, if you have 20,000 phone numbers on your cell phone and you only call about 100 people, it's so much easier just to get rid of all the extras that you don't want and don't need, that were childhood friends that you've lost contact with, or people that you're no longer friendly with. And that's what the endocannabinoids do. They do a great deal of critical elements, critical steps in the process of hooking up the brain. But unfortunately, the message is not getting out to people, especially and particularly in this case, pregnant women, because their past month daily or near daily marijuana use has just climbed. The dark bars are 2002 to 2003. The number of non-pregnant women using marijuana has gone up. The number of pregnant women using marijuana has gone up. The number of pregnant women using marijuana in the first trimester, the second trimester, the third trimester have all gone up. Use has increased with normalizing, medicalizing, commercializing, legalizing. And one of the interesting things about the use is that some magazines, women's health magazines, have told women that it's healthy to use marijuana during pregnancy because it's going to alleviate some pregnancy-related symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and therefore it's good and it's a natural plant. But marijuana use in pregnancy increases the risk of preterm deliveries. It increases the risk of neonatal intensive care unit admissions. It decreases the mean birth weight of a child, and it decreases their 1-minute score called an APGAR score that gauges how healthy the child is just right after birth. It decreases the head circumference of the babies. Now you may say, well, okay, these are things, but they're sad, they're undesirable, but what does that mean for later on? So there's data that's just coming out now that says marijuana in the fetal brain changes signaling systems. It can create errors in the growth of these connections, errors in migration. It can reorganize the circuitry of the cortex, the thinking, the very human part of the brain. It can affect how nerve cells change into special shapes and functions that are desired. And this new study, which started about 7 years ago, called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, ABCD, which has recruited about 11,000 children, and many of them are now 12 years old. They were recruited long before then. And what they're finding is that prenatal cannabis exposure, I'll use marijuana and cannabis interchangeably, increases the risks for psychopathology. It increases psychotic-like experiences. It reduces white and gray matter. It can affect attention, thinking, reduces function, social problems, and it can cause sleep disorders. So this was one of the first studies that was published on the ABCD problem. And it looked at children who were exposed to marijuana prenatally. And what they did was look at psychosis proneness, a questionnaire that says, are there symptoms that are consistent with people who have a psychosis, but they're not psychotic? And what they found is that the prevalence of psychosis proneness increased in those children that were exposed in utero when their mother was pregnant. This study just came out last month, and it's the most comprehensive of the lot. And what they looked at now, these are now 12-year-olds, because this is a couple of years later than the one I've just discussed. They looked at prenatal marijuana exposure and the mental health burden of children exposed compared with non-exposed, compared with children whose mothers did not use marijuana when pregnant. The number of problems they have in total has increased seriously compared to never exposed. Never exposed is right here, right down this line. Psychotic-like symptoms, as I mentioned, ADHD problems, obsessive compulsive problems, stress problems, aggressive behavior, thought problems, externalizing problems, social problems, attention problems, conduct problems, rule-breaking behavior. The length of the PAR is how significantly different these symptoms occur compared with children, 12 years old, who have not been exposed. And what you can see is that there is quite an array. Now, perhaps genetically they're different, perhaps their parents use because there's something endemic in the family, genetic makeup that makes them more likely to use. It's a lot of these possible confounds have been looked at statistically. And these are the symptoms that shake out if you really analyze for marijuana exposure versus non-exposure in the uterus. So I urge you to think very carefully about this problem and try, just for reasons of caution, to convince people who are pregnant to stay, to convince mothers who are pregnant and women who are thinking of getting pregnant to stay away from this drug. There's also unintentional poisoning of children. It's rising, especially in states with legal marijuana. The causes are largely resin and cookies and candies and beverages and hemp oil, because the children sometimes can't distinguish these from ordinary household foods or stuffs. There's also growing evidence of the effects of passive smoke. And there's signs of cannabis ingestion, which says the child can be lethargic, can lose muscle tone and function. They have a fast heartbeat, and one should be alerted that this can happen to children who are unintentionally poisoned by parents or siblings leaving cannabis, different types, around in the house. So what has happened with youth emergency departments? With marijuana legalization for 6 years, from 2013 to 19, we've seen a 71% increase in pediatric patient cases involving marijuana after legalization. The majority of cases are between 15 and 17. 43% of the chief complaints are suicidal ideation, vomiting, nausea, trauma, altered mental status, and some abnormalities of vital signs, rapid heart rate, high blood pressure. So when cannabis use is growing amongst young adolescents and young adults, physicians should consider this use when evaluating these complaints. So let's just summarize what we've learned. Exposure to marijuana in utero, there are brain changes in signaling, cell growth, in circuit formation, in nerve cells and white matter. At birth, there are problems in terms of preterm. Small children are born before term with small head, low birth weight, and they end up in the neonatal ICU. They have functional deficits in terms of attention, thinking, and reduced cognition. They have social problems, sleep problems, and an increase in proneness to psychosis, as well as sleep problems. So once again, this is a cautionary tale for people who think marijuana can benefit symptom relief during pregnancy. The consequences of marijuana to the adolescent, they're also rising, partly because more adolescents are using, but partly because we're learning a lot more about these consequences over time. In fact, the good is just being swamped. You know, the benefits that people claim they have when they use, especially among adolescents, is being swamped by what the scientific data is telling us. First, let's look at where the US stands in terms of the global marijuana problem. We lead the world in terms of cannabis use disorder among 15 to 19-year-olds. We're number one. That's a dubious distinction. Canada is not far behind, and neither is Spain. Australia, New Zealand are also competing with us, but not as well as we are ourselves. Introduction of marijuana to the adolescent has a much greater risk for cannabis or marijuana use disorder. Within the first year, a heavy marijuana user has a 10.9% chance of developing a cannabis use disorder. These are 12 to 17-year-olds. By the second year, it's up to 15. By the third year, it's up to 18. By the fourth year, 1 in 5 young people who use cannabis heavily have a cannabis use disorder, which can be sometimes very difficult to treat. Among adults, it's almost half of that. So later initiation confers a higher protective factor compared to the young adults. Marijuana use during adolescence is associated with an increased risk of depression and suicidal behavior later on in life. percentage of suicides that are positive for marijuana in Colorado have increased. The risk ratio, non-users, is always 1. For depression, suicidal ideas, and suicide attempts is much higher. So, another risk factor. Marijuana use can impact educational achievement. In high school, there's evidence for lower grades. Young people are more likely to drop out, less likely to enter college. Unoccasional users, they're more likely to delay enrolling in use and drop out. Among frequent users, they're less likely to enroll, and they're more likely to drop out of college. Another thing to remember. Teen marijuana use can also affect adult motivation. This is from never used to use more than 400 times, initiated during youth, during adolescence. So if a child never, that's a tricky little button. If they never use, compared to using very frequently, they're much less likely to graduate college. They're more likely to be unemployed. They're much more likely to be on welfare. Not a pretty scene for the more frequent marijuana use before the age of 17, the worse the outcomes. And these are just other studies done by other people in terms of never use, less monthly, monthly or more, weekly or more, daily or more. The more you use, the more likely it is to have a cannabis use disorder, other illicit drug use, and a suicide attempt. Worse outcomes in terms of all these things. So, not a safe activity during adolescence. Now, those who begin regular use in teens have poor, much later life outcomes. So they start at 15, they're watched until the age of 35. So this is a very long, this is a 20 years look at what happens. By mid-30s, youth onset of regular use is more likely than minimal or non-users to use other illicit drugs, 20 times the risk of using other drugs. Be a high-risk alcohol drinker, 3.7 times. Smoke daily, 7 times. Less likely to be in a relationship, less than half. Adolescent cannabis use is associated with increased risk for psychosis in later life. It predicts an earlier age of onset. What are the modifiers? Age of onset, frequency, exposure to trauma, use of other substances. All of these factors feed in to whether or not there will be a higher probability of having an earlier onset of psychosis. And of course, genetic factors. Oh, my dear computer is frozen. Let me try to. This is a very, there we go. Adway Wadaker, who was a high school student and a math whiz and a statistician whiz, published this paper alone. He went to school in central Massachusetts. He's now in college. I worked with him for a number of years. And he found by looking at survey data that the highest risk for opioid use disorder in adults is marijuana use before the age of 18. It's higher a risk than mental illness, than drug selling encounter, than health, access, income, education, employment, alcohol use before 18, race, obesity, disability, gender, all of these things. Before the age of 18, That is the number one risk for developing an opioid use disorder. So let's summarize what we have found with the teen brain and marijuana. Marijuana changes the teen brain. We didn't have time to go through all these wonderful imaging and test tube studies. Addiction is higher for teens. Deficits in cognition and brain function. It has effects on education, on short-term memory. It has effects on IQ if heavy use is continued into your 30s. It has effects on school performance. It has effects on amotivation, higher school dropouts. It has effects on psychiatric diseases, psychosis, anxiety, suicidality, and it has effects on safety. So, what have we learned? That cannabis use amongst teenagers, the US leads the world in it. Adolescents are much greater risk for developing a use disorder. In emergency departments, there's been a 71% increase, and these are outdated numbers, it's higher now, of adolescents since legal marijuana. There's increased suicidality during adolescence and later on. Heavy marijuana use is associated with a poor educational, employment, mental health outcomes as adults. There's an increased risk for psychosis and for substance use disorders in adulthood, and there's a higher risk for opioid use disorder. So we now turn to psychosis, because psychosis has been on the mind of many people with regard to marijuana. It's a long story. It actually dates to the 1800s when the India Hemp Commission was formed by the British when they occupied India. And they found that in what they called insane asylum, this was in Bengal, India, that about between 20 and 45% of the people in the insane asylum were heavy marijuana users. They didn't find a correlation between psychosis and alcohol or opioids. It was marijuana. And their conclusion was that somehow marijuana is a risk, could be a risk factor for psychosis. So what is psychosis? What is schizophrenia? It's characterized by a number of core symptoms, including paranoia, bizarre thoughts, delusions, fragmented, disordered thoughts, hallucinations. You hear, you see, you feel. The criteria for trying to say, well, marijuana causes it rather than it simply is associated with it. Maybe it's people who have these problems, these demons in their brain. Maybe they use marijuana to try to alleviate them. That's called a correlation. Causation says that marijuana is actually causing the psychosis and schizophrenia. So schizophrenia has the symptoms of psychosis, but it's a much longer lasting disorder that has to persist for a very significant period of time before it's considered disease stage. So what are the criteria? First of all, how strong is the association? The larger the association, the more likely the cause. How consistent is it? Is it consistent in different places, different cities? What about the timing? Does the use of marijuana happen before the psychosis, or does the psychosis happen after you use marijuana? In other words, does marijuana use precede, or does it come after the effect? What about dose response? The more you use, the more the symptoms. The less you use, the fewer the symptoms. What about specificity? specific population with no other likely explanation that you can identify, and a biological plausibility, the connection between cause and effect. So the most robust risk factors for developing schizophrenia that are non-organic, meaning not dysfunction of the liver, serious infections, head trauma, things like that. This was a huge analysis of 390 meta-analyses, which encompassed thousands of manuscripts. It was published last year. A clinical high risk state for psychosis is the highest risk factor, which means that genetically you come from a family with it. There are certain, conditions of birth and so on that may have precipitated these symptoms later on in life during development. Number 2 was cannabis use, 3.9 increased risk, or fourfold, or 400% increased risk, and childhood adversities, which was about 2.8 or threefold risk. And these were the risks for psychosis. What about consistency in different places? In the United Kingdom, in Germany, New Zealand, Israel, Sweden, US, Netherlands, and so on. In all these are different studies done at different times. They all said that marijuana use increases the risk for psychosis in different nations. What about dose? Dose response is another criteria. So this is a tale of 3 cities. It's actually many more. It was 11, but we'll highlight London, Amsterdam, and Paris. This was reported just 3 years ago by that wonderful investigator, Marta de Forti, in London. And what she found is that, very simply, if you never use, compared to use less than 10%, low potency, once a week, rarely use. If you use more than 10% one time a week, if you use daily less than 10%, or if you use daily more than 10%, each one of these increase the risk for psychosis, each one of these. The dose response was clear as a whistle in these 3 cities. And at least 5 other studies have shown that there is a dose response connection. Well, can THC of marijuana induce psychosis in otherwise normal people? 14 studies, 15 independent samples, 324 participants have shown, yes, that giving THC to people can produce a higher prevalence of psychotic, negative, and other psychiatric symptoms. A single dose. The risk of cannabis use, cannabinoids with THC, for recreational or therapeutic purposes is real if just normal people get a reasonably high dose, and many of these studies are done with intravenous. So, in consequences in adults with no pre-existing medical or psychiatric disorders, the consequences are, in terms of medical disorders, mental disorders, psychosis is the top ranking adverse consequence. Psychosocial function is next, motivation, executive function, working memory, and anxiety. What contributes? How often? How much THC? And at what age did you begin? Same theme that recurs over and over and over again. And how much total have you been exposed to? So if you look at causality or association, you look at the 6 criteria, a lot of them are being filled. And there's more and more evidence that's weighing towards causality rather than just simple association. So what lessons have we learned? We've learned lessons from both the opioid crisis and marijuana. Vast sums of money are spent to promote. They're promoted for many medical conditions. They're promoted as safe and non-addictive. There's poor scientific evidence for chronic heavy use, like daily use of marijuana, although it's getting pretty robust now. In dispensaries, it's the bud tender's discretion of what kind of marijuana to use. What training does a bud tender have? Medical education is lagged far behind. The people who advocate for its positive effects receive all the attention, the opponents don't. Youth use is very high, and high potency drugs are flooding the nation. And we have conflated medical and recreational drug use. And what has happened? Government regulations have utterly failed to protect the public. No matter how much you regulate, if there are concerted campaigns, lobbyists, media that are on board, ad people, physicians who are on board, nothing is going to protect the individual, and in some cases, all of society. So, our next wave are hallucinogens in medicine. In science, policy, and reality. Why? Because there's a large public health burden of chronic brain disorders. The treatment needs are unmet or inadequate. There are conditions of internalizing disorders. All premises on drug policy are now being questioned. And the reality is, how solid is the science? Can all the protocols that have been used to develop hallucinogens to treat brain problems, can they be scaled? And what is the reality of unintended consequences? We've seen marijuana as a panacea for many medical conditions. We're now seeing hallucinogens being proposed for all these medical conditions. These are a list of marijuana for medical conditions, of which there isn't a smidgen of evidence for 95% of them. Smidgen. And yet they're being promoted. So what do we have in terms of the year 2022? What does our society face? We have opioids as a massive opioid challenge. The overdose crisis is flaming. We have marijuana as a problem. We have cocaine and methamphetamine. We have new psychoactive substances that are being produced at an incredible rate. And the promotion of hallucinogens as medicine, with a very powerful movement to normalize and legalize all drug use, remove all constraints on society. Let the treatment providers pick up the pieces after this. And so with hallucinogens now, with marijuana, with the opioids, there are people in our past history, Cassandra, Laocoon, and ancient Greek and Latin fables, the Aeneid and the Iliad, that try to warn people of some of the adversity that could face their society if they don't listen to caution. And they were killed. And the Trojan horse came in and destroyed Troy. I am hoping that our society is going to be able to resist a complete movement to legalize everything. What can you do? Speak to others. tell as many people as possible the hazards of drug use during pregnancy for the developing fetus, the hazards of drug use in adolescence, the hazards of potent drugs with high THC that can just exacerbate the problems, the critical importance of parental influence on offspring use. Speak to others, folks, and remember, this is not a war on drugs. This is always and has been a defense of our brains, which is the repository of our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madras. And I think that there's going to be a bunch of questions. I can't believe how much you packed in to a 1-hour presentation. It's amazing. I have a couple questions that are queued up, so I'll start there and invite people who might have been confused because I misspoke earlier. The chat is disabled, but the Q&A tab is open, and anybody who has questions can add them there and I'll read them in order. And you need to go. You need to go. Go. Sorry. Working from home. So the first question came in earlier, and the question is, does the marijuana component that you covered about fetuses and pregnancy pertain to women only or to men as well regarding the development of the fetus?
Beautiful question. Beautiful question. So there's some data. It's preclinical. It's not, it's been done in rodents because you can't ethically do this in people. And here's the study, and it's quite a beautiful study done by Yasmin Hurd at Mount Sinai in New York. She gave adolescent male rats, adolescent female rats, THC, daily for a few weeks during their adolescence. Then she stopped giving the drug and allowed them to grow up. They never saw THC again, ever, ever, ever. The male rats, the females were not given THC, only the males, because this pertains to this question. There are other studies that have the females, but in this case, it was only the males. The male rats that had been exposed only during adolescence mated with the females. And so there was no THC in their body during conception. There was no THC ever in the fetus. And then the fetus was delivered and they were allowed to grow up. And then they were measured in terms of their brain changes, in terms of their heroin seeking. And the animals that had been sired by an adult male who had been exposed to THC during adolescence consumed much more heroin, sought more heroin, and they had very significant brain changes. And the conclusion of this study was that there are epigenetic changes in the sperm cells of the male that get transmitted to the fetus, and they affect development of the next generation. So it's a very good question. Now, I'd love to see other studies like this. We can't lean on 1 or 2. We'd like to see 5 or 10 done by different labs, but this was a very intriguing one.
Thank you. That was a great question to start off with.
Yes.
Another good one. What's the definition of a cannabis use disorder?
I can easily, if I may, I can find a slide and I'll come back to it while I'm talking. I will fish in and then it'll just be so clear on the screen. Okay.
Okay. All right. Let me see the next one then.
Because it's so much easier to, basically the cannabis use disorder is a spectrum of use from but it always involves loss of control, increasing adverse consequences, use despite the adverse consequences, and use in dangerous situations, and developing tolerance to it. But I will summarize them all in a simple slide. Okay.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Next question is, why can't any medicinal benefits be gained without the presence of THC?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, the person is wondering, let me rephrase it. They want to know, can you get medicinal benefits from marijuana without the presence of THC?
Very interesting question, a very good one. Okay, let me show you. So marijuana has it has over 120 chemicals in it. And these 120 chemicals are cannabinoids. So it has cannabinoids plus many other chemicals. There are some cannabinoids in it, for example, cannabidiol, which has been approved by the FDA to treat Dravet's and Lennox-Gastaut, 2 types of childhood seizure disorders. It was approved a couple of years ago. It has effectiveness in dampening seizures, and it has no psychoactive effects. And what's interesting about it is that it does possibly have neuroprotective effects as well in limited cases. Now, we have data, in fact, showing that it can protect at very high doses. It can protect the adolescent brain from the adverse effects of marijuana at very high doses. These are not published yet, so I'd rather not make them into a real public display, but they're very interesting. So there are at least 15 other cannabinoids in the plant that are of interest. They're very low concentrations, very low, but they are considered intriguing in terms of therapeutic benefit. They're being looked at for pain. They're being looked at for seizure disorders and a few other indications. So there obviously, cannabidiol is the first non-psychoactive component of marijuana that has been approved by the FDA that has therapeutic benefit. And I think that's really important. Let me try to show it. The most important thing about all of these studies is that people are not, THC has not been, marijuana has not been approved by the FDA for any use whatsoever. That's really important to recognize. And cannabidiol is a standalone compound within the plant that has been isolated for this purpose. If you can see this slide, well, let me just show this one to you. Is this visible to you, Amanda?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the composition of marijuana smoke compared to tobacco smoke. It's a very complicated slide. But if you go down pyridine, quinoline, toluene, benzene, styrene, acrylonitrile, isoprene, hydroquinone, beta paracresols, tar, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, ammonia, and so on, they're very similar. You know, basically, it's the kind of product that should not be considered a medicine unless you're willing to approve tobacco smoking as medicine, because the chemical composition is very, very close. other than one has nicotine, the other has cannabinoids. But marijuana in current levels have 20 times more ammonia, 5 times more hydrogen cyanide, more tar, benzene, toluene, and hydrocarbons. Now, we don't see a great deal of evidence that, that marijuana is causing cancer, except with the possible exception of testicular cancer. But that isn't to say that with these high dose uses with concentrates that have no history, the data will be forthcoming. We just don't know. We do know that it has very adverse effects on pulmonary function, on bronchi and so on. So it's definitely a problem with regard to a number of consequences. I'm still, my computer's frozen again, so I can't find but the criteria, there are 11 criteria for cannabis use disorder. Let me just go through them quickly. One is using more than you intended. Using despite adverse consequences, trying to quit and not being able to quit, escalating the dose, using in dangerous situations, developing tolerance to the drug, and so on. I have a wonderful case study of a young teenager who started using in grade 7 and was followed through. This was a report that was classical in terms of him showing the signs of starting to use monthly, then weekly, then daily, and then not being able to stop, trying to stop. And every time he tried, he felt so terrible, because when you stop, you have severe sleep disorders. You have real problems. You feel bad just as you do when you stop opioids. And so you reinstate use as fast as you can to try to get rid of the symptoms. And so these are the core ones, but I'd love to just show you the block of things if I didn't freeze up.
If you're open to it, when this event is over, if you want to email it to me separately, I can send it out to the participants later as a still.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that as a workaround.
Yeah.
All right. The next question is, marijuana seems less lethal than other drugs. Is that why it's more acceptable to use?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, I have a wonderful slide showing the distribution of marijuana targets in the brain compared to the distribution of opioid targets in the brain. And the opioid targets in the brain are in the base of the brain that controls heart rate and breathing. There are no targets for marijuana there. That's why it is very difficult to die from a marijuana overdose. It just is rare. There are a few cases reported, probably 20, but considering the number of users, it's very rare. It is not rare in terms of people who take chances under the influence. It's not rare in car fatalities any longer, because people have compromised cognition and therefore they can kill themselves or kill others in car accidents. And fatalities in which marijuana is the only drug have gone up. But overdosing is very, very difficult because marijuana is not in those key centers that control your vital signs. However, the question is, we all agree that death is the worst thing that can happen to you after using a drug. I don't think there's anything worse than that. It's impossible for it to be worse. But the other consequences are related to quality of life. And those can be very serious as well. And we should not marginalize the concerns that we have in terms of the psychological, the psychiatric, the behavioral consequences of a drug that can derail a person's potential.
Thank you. Um, the other question kind of has multiple parts. Can you tell us any more about the impacts of youth use on education, graduation, and future success?
Well, there are impacts of marijuana on this. There are a number of studies that have said there are reduced high school graduation rates, there are reduced college graduation rates. There are, Amelia Area at Columbia has done wonderful studies on the consequences of marijuana use to teenagers in college, as well as, once they become young adults. And there's a whole shopping list of them in terms of reduced interest in extracurricular activities, lower grades at school, more absentee rates, just not showing up for classes, more problems with parents, more problems with other students, more social problems, more withdrawal from the entire college experience. And, if anybody's interested, they really should just go into PubMed, which is available to everyone in this, and just look up her research on college students and marijuana. The shopping list is so long, I can't summarize it here, but she's not the only one doing the research now. Okay, I've got it finally. My computer unfroze. I will share my screen. And go into here. Please don't freeze, please. There we go. So these are the DSM-5 criteria. So it starts with a preamble: pattern of use leading to significant impairment or distress, at least 2 symptoms within 12 months. Continued use despite problems, that's number 1, which I said. Repeated efforts to quit or cut down, use larger amounts for longer periods, experience withdrawal symptoms, which means your brain has adapted. Your brain has changed and it's no longer the way it was before you started using. And that's why you have withdrawal. Excessive time spent using, need to use to stop withdrawal symptoms, develop tolerance, use in hazardous conditions. And this is the case study which follows right after. Do you mind? I'm going to close out my presentation because that's what's blocking me. It is such a large one with so many, some important activities. People with cannabis use disorder are more likely to use other substances, are 6 times more likely to have an alcohol use disorder, 9 times more likely to have a drug use disorder, and 75% who seek treatment have another substance use disorder. This is the case presentation, which I've always loved to present because it's so sad. And actually it has a very nice outcome. But I must close out my other slide presentation because it's definitely slowing down the computer. So here is little Zach. This is published in a journal, which you can see, Adolescent Treatment Counseling. Senior Zach began using marijuana in 7th grade. He used once every few weeks, then he used once a week. In mid-8th grade, he started to use daily, then he smoked every morning before school. Smokers know that if you need that first cigarette in the morning, and drinkers know if you need that first drink in the morning, you've got a problem because you're in withdrawal. And the withdrawal is what's driving the use at the first thing in the morning because your body has been drained of the drug and it's in desperate need of it. So we have to recognize that that is a real issue. So he began using larger amounts for longer periods. By 9th grade, he couldn't get to school without smoking. Couldn't eat, sleep without, it dictated his life. He was using it all the time. He was doing everything to make it seem like the drugs weren't infecting him in a bad way. He tried to quit, but he experienced withdrawal symptoms, and then he used to stop withdrawal symptoms. These are in the turquoise text. These are his own self-reports. He continued using besides having problems. He wanted to quit. He would try. He had repeated efforts to stop. And then near midnight, the San Francisco Police Department, he'd been arrested for public intoxication. He was bloody. He was planning to drive home, but he couldn't find his car. He had no memory of being hit in the face. He used in hazardous situations. It literally ruins everything in your life because nothing else is as fun. His mother took hold of Zach and literally brought him to treatment. And the outcome was that he was in great shape. He really had a wonderful recovery story. So that's the little story of Zach.
I can see why you like that one. It's really nice to personalize it. I think sometimes we're talking in such large numbers. All right,
That's right. It humanizes it.
Yeah. All right, I have more questions. So first a comment, thank you so much for your presentation. Can you explain the connection between cannabis use, and cannabinoid hypermesis syndrome? Why does it happen? And is it tied to age, potency, or frequency of use?
It's a great question. Cannabis hyperemesis syndrome is growing. Nobody knows the mechanism, but there is some hints that it's related to a substance P receptor, which is a receptor that can feel hot, cold, and pain. Hot showers can relieve the vomiting, but many people are being brought in. It's still a very small percentage of users, but it's developing among users that are going to the emergency department. And there's a growing record of its prevalence. There is a lot of research that still has to be done on how it happens, but it's not unheard of. I think it's related to potency. And I can tell you that we have some preclinical data that indicate that it is related to potency.
Thank you. This one, I'm just going to read it because I'm going in order. Amazing presentation. Is it possible to get a copy of your slide deck? If not, how do we obtain references on the most recent studies?
I can just send a list of the references. I usually don't give out the slide deck because it's become a real, some of the studies, I mean, some of my slides, I use unpublished data that I've just generated and things like that. And I prefer not to distribute them, but all the references can come.
Wonderful. What place at the table, if any, have you and your colleagues had with policymakers as legalization efforts have been rolling out? I have done a great deal of efforts at the table during my lifetime. When I was deputy director at ONDCP, we spent some very significant efforts at trying to curtail the movement to legalize the drug. I've worked behind the scenes in many different venues with people, developing position papers. I've testified in front of state governments here and in Canada, in South Africa and Taiwan, you name it, on why this should not be done. And whenever there was an opportunity to voice my concerns, I have voiced it. The problem is that, as with the opioids, the people, the voices of caution, are so outspent by the profiteers.
the amount of money that's gone into lobbying state by state, hiring lawyers, hiring admin, showing up in media, in editorial offices, it's well over $150 million now. And the ratio of spending by the lobby versus the people who are voices of caution, generally, who don't have much money, is in some states it's been 30-1, 10-1, 2-1. In only one state, a billionaire gave money for the opposing side, one state, and they won. Now, my anecdote for Massachusetts is I've testified in the Massachusetts legislature. I've helped develop all the position papers on this, but one day before the medical marijuana ballot initiative and before the legalization initiative, I walked into the editorial offices of the Boston Globe. Each time it was a team. First time it was 3 people, an African-American minister from Roxbury in Boston, and a district attorney. And I presented them with the data on what we have about medical marijuana, just showed them. Before I began, the editor, one of the editors of the editorial page said, "Don't even bother talking to us. We've already been visited by the proponents of this bill, and nothing you can say will change our minds." And the 3 of us just presented our information, and I was certain it was a lost cause. And 2 days later, the Boston Globe issued an editorial saying, "Vote no." Fast forward a few years, and then legalization came up. This time we had a larger team of people. We presented the data on the risks to adolescents and so on. We were sure that it was the same scenario. A few days later, editorial said, "Vote no," in the Boston Globe. Then you look at Wikipedia. At that time, things have changed a little bit. But Wikipedia had a list of all the newspapers endorsing legalization of marijuana and medicalization in Massachusetts. They left out the Boston Globe, the most influential paper in New England. So I went to the Boston Globe's archives via internet. I paid $30 for each editorial because I did not have an electronic copy. I went into Wikipedia and I inserted the 2 editorials from the Boston Globe. And as I was typing them in, because I had to type them in by hand, somebody was erasing them. I tried at 2 in the morning. I tried at 5 in the morning. I tried at 9 in the morning. I tried at 4 in the afternoon. And no matter what time of the day or night I tried, the editorial verbatim from the Boston Globe was erased. That's how profound the resolve is of people who want this drug on the market without balance, without caution.
I'm speechless.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a true story because I have it all on my archives in my computer.
It's hard to move on from this one.
Yeah.
But the next question I'm thinking comes from a parent, and it's important. I don't know if you have an answer for it, but she wrote, "How do we protect our children from getting marijuana laced with fentanyl?"
I think the answer is pretty simple. Don't use marijuana. There is no such thing as safe supply any longer. A child should not be able to go into a dispensary. It's illegal, right? It's illegal for them to use it medicinally or for recreational purposes. They can't, under, I think it's 18 or 21, they can't walk into any place that's retailing marijuana, regardless of the alleged reasons for it. So the only way they can get it is by passage from one person to another, in which case there's no guaranteed safe supply. Now, the evidence for fentanyl lacing marijuana is weak. There's some reports of it. I've had some policemen tell me they have found it. Others have claimed that it's not true. I don't know that, but I do know that it's a possibility, because if fentanyl is getting into antidepressant pills that are being sold on the market, or antihistamines and so on, there is no reason why the cartels are not going to try the largest base of customers of drugs, and that is the marijuana user.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. I know we only have a few minutes left. We'll see how fast we can go. This one came in. It's a great question. On your slide about Zach, what treatment did he obtain that helped him?
Well, there's no medications to treat marijuana addiction. He was fortunate because he was caught early. His mother was conscientious. And so there are treatments that are developed for adolescents that are, you don't put an adolescent into an adult situation with treatment. You try to empathize and understand how they think, how they feel, how they perceive. And I do not know the details of his treatment because it was not published in that report, but I do believe it was cognitive behavioral therapy. That's pretty much, we have talk therapy because we don't have medications for marijuana. And that's a really important issue. With opioids, we have medications. We just don't distribute them and handle them properly. They do help. They help a lot of people. But there's nothing for marijuana. There's nothing for cocaine. I spent 10 years of my life trying to design a cocaine medication. That's where some of my patents are from. I just kept trying and no matter how many ways we devised and trying to, look at the biology and figure out how we can circumvent or surmount the cocaine effect, it just didn't work. People are trying antibodies to it to prevent it from getting in the brain. The only danger to that is that people end up using more to surmount the antibodies, which could kill them.
Thank you. I'm going to have to truncate this one a little bit because it's long. The doctor has shared important and alarming information, including that seeing more acceptance and accessibility causes teens and the general population to use more. Can the doctor talk about how the economic benefits and profits will not compare with the social, educational, physical, and mental health issues that will rise?
It's a great question. So think about tax revenues and this just came up today. The tax revenues for alcohol, which are huge, and for tobacco are 1/10 what it costs to take care of the health consequences. It's a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you tax a bottle of alcohol $1, the consequences of alcohol use disorder is going to cost $10 in terms of medical, social, and criminal justice. For tobacco, there's not criminal justice, but medical is overwhelming. The social costs are not as high, but the medical costs are horrendous. And the ratio of deaths from tobacco to alcohol are 4-to-1. It's 400,000 versus about 100,000 for alcohol. With marijuana, there's only one study that has been published so far from Colorado. Unfortunately, because the legalization window is so narrow still compared to tobacco we've had for about 120 years or more. Alcohol we've had for millennia. And the research studies have gathered steam for 100 years on both of those. For marijuana, with legalization, we've had very little data still. But in Colorado, one study showed that the ratio was 4.5 to 1. So for every tax dollar raised from selling, it costs the state about $4.5 to address the consequences. Now, it's still a fuzzy number because there are so many consequences that take time to kick in. You know, lost educational achievement, unemployment, IQ loss. All of these have not really evolved the way they have for alcohol, for example. So my guess, and it's an educated guess, is that it's going to probably come close to the 10 to 1 for the other drugs. Now, with regard to the opioids, the costs to the country have been estimated at between $70 billion to $400 billion in terms of the consequences. And to add to the problem with marijuana costs, California and some of the other states are begging the state governments to eliminate the taxes they collect because their product is costing too much for regulation, for consequences, and they cannot compete with the illegal cartels. So if they eliminate the tax revenues because they're trying to undersell the illegal grows and the cartels that are selling it, then there won't even be a tax revenue and the costs will just overwhelm any type of revenue gained from selling the drug.
Thank you. That's definitely been a topic in a lot of our communities right now. There's a few more questions. How much time do you have, Dr. Madras?
I have a few more minutes.
Okay. One question here. I'm trying to front load the parental ones too. Do you believe a lot of this usage comes from early childhood trauma?
In some cases, it certainly does, but definitely not all. It's fascinating, but I mean, early childhood traumas is highly correlated with opioid use, with all drug use. And, you know, all one has to do is walk in the streets of Brazil and see kids who've been thrown out of their homes at the age of 5 to 10, sniffing gasoline to know that that is their comfort zone, to try to dull the pain that they feel, the loneliness, the isolation, and the lack of love. But to claim that all marijuana use is related to this is, I think it's a profound oversimplification, because peers have an enormous influence on what kids do. Parents do as well. I've met two very high profile men who will be known to many of you if I even say one more word. But both of them use marijuana with their teenage sons to bond with them, to be friendly with them, to show that they're cool. And both of those sons developed severe heroin addiction. One is dead, one is alive. And there's no insight into the fathers trying to make that connection. So I believe that there is a profound role that parents can play in how they present drugs, and not to buy into the common standards that the media has portrayed, because the media has had tremendous influence on how people think about marijuana. And a lot of people use marijuana casually. They get away with it, including reporters. I know them. And they will talk about it because they've personalized it. From their perspective, they use nothing's happened. So what's, all this is just a pearl clutching, old generation that's trying to dampen our fun. That's not really what it is at all. But the media has actually provoked some of our problems, and they hold some of the culpability in this case.
Thank you. In the interest of time, there's at least one more question.
Sure.
I did want to say real quickly some of the kudos. One person wrote, "I'm speechless. That was mind-blowing. I think this presentation was informative. Thank you so much. Thank you for your deeply honest experience and assessment of what we're up against." A few others, but this last one, I'll have this be the last question. "It seems like, given this information, why can't the proponents of marijuana be sued the same way drug dealers are if there is no medicinal benefit from it? I think we are being lied to by big money."
That's a great question. There are people, lawyers in the country, working on creating law cases against marijuana. One of them, but the problem is you have to prove adverse consequences. And there's where all this issue of, for example, correlation versus causation comes in. Because what you see is people saying, well, it's not causation. It didn't cause this problem. It's that something's wrong with you, or it's just a correlation. And that's a big problem in pursuing these law cases. In terms of medicine, the insurance companies don't reimburse for marijuana because the FDA has not approved it. So you can't sue a pharmaceutical company like you did with the opioids, which settled for $23 billion this past year. They were culpable because they misled the users. They misled the physicians. They misled the people who were using. They're not the only ones culpable. There are 32 reasons why this opioid disasters happened in our country, which I'm for another time. But finding cases where you can unequivocally say it's marijuana, like let's say a person kills someone driving and they have marijuana and alcohol. You go in front of a judge and you say they're positive for marijuana and alcohol. The judge will say, but it's alcohol. You can't sue the dispensary. So it is complex, but there are cases that are beginning to emerge. And if there is a groundswell of support for them, I think this will take off. The other issue that you've asked is what I've done. I just recall that I was the sole expert witness for the U.S. Department of Justice in the Eastern District of California, where there was a lawsuit trying to deschedule marijuana or reschedule it into a medical category. And it was a complicated case, but that suit, we won. The Department of Justice won. I was up against 7 expert witnesses on the side of the marijuana lobby, including physicians, including growers, and so on. That case almost put an end to the federal court cases trying to use the federal court, because another case arose within months, and the lawyer for the marijuana proponents read the transcript of it and said, we'll never be able to win. And that was the end of it. So that was, and in the Vatican Pontifical Academy of Sciences, in the final statement of the Academy, there was plenty on marijuana. And I know somebody very well who helped carve those final statements.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much,
You're
Dr.
very
Madras.
welcome.
You've given us your entire evening after probably what was already a very busy day. And I also want to thank everybody who came out to listen and learn, to remind people to please do the exit survey when you see it appear on your screen or in an email tomorrow. And yeah, just thank you all around. This has been really wonderful.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, don't always listen to what the media say. There is a truth in the science and in the literature that is far more impressive than what somebody picks up from talking points. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone. Enjoy
night.
the rest of your evening.